This slide set continues our topic, Martin Luther King Jr., a prophet for our time. A special note on the status of FBI Director Hoover's civil rights mole. By early 1947, President Truman had forced the FBI to turn over its South American operations to an embryonic CIA. Livid and angry, Hoover ordered a scorched earth withdrawal. All FBI files were burned, and the informants were dismissed in a failed effort to keep them from the incoming CIA. The exceptions to that would have included Hoover's newly found civil rights penetrator, who was certainly in Washington, D.C. or New York by the time the final pieces of the new CIA were in place in 1951. By that time, Dr. King was preparing to begin his graduate studies at the University of Boston and was not yet on Hoover's radar. MLK Prelude, Part 3, Boston University School of Theology, an adult skilled in critical analysis. Davis, Brightman, and the appeal of a personal God to King Jr. Just 22 years old in the spring of 1951, King accepted the admission offer from Boston University's graduate school. Already with 7 years of higher education under his belt, his decision allowed him to bypass most all Baptist ministers. His high-quality sermons at Ebenezer, although infrequent, displayed, according to his father, the fire that makes for brilliance in every theological setting. At Morehouse, King had benefited from the teachings of George W. Davis, a Baptist theologian who used modern theology to interpret teachings of the social gospel. Davis had introduced King to personalism, a school of thought in which Boston University professor Edgar S. Brightman was a leading authority. Brightman's theology appealed to King because of its emphasis on the ability to find God through personal religious experience. This helped to give King Jr. a metaphysical and philosophical understanding for a personal God. King at work in Boston and Atlanta. On February 1952, King fulfilled the language requirement at Boston University by passing his French examination. Back home in May, he preached the relevance of the Holy Spirit at Ebenezer and took 2 intercession courses at Boston University on seminar in historical theology and history of recent philosophy. In June, King was initiated into Boston's Sigma chapter of the Alpha Phi Alpha social fraternity. In July, he attended the annual session of Georgia's Sunday School and Baptist Training Union Congress in Atlanta. In August, Coretta Scott visited Atlanta and met the King family for the first time. In August, King preached The Challenge of Communism to Christianity at Ebenezer. And in September, at Ebenezer, he preached Mental and Spiritual Slavery. King's first year at Boston University School of Theology. King's first term of his second year at Boston in September 1952 included religious teachings of the Old Testament, History of Christian Doctrine 1, Seminar in Philosophy on Hegel, and Seminar in the History of Philosophy. He also enrolled in the philosophy of Plato at Harvard. In November, Shaw University President William R. Strassner asked King to apply to become the university's Dean of Religion. In the fall, King preached at John Street Baptist Church in Worcester, Massachusetts. In January 1953, King's last Harvard course was on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. In his last course at Boston, King enrolled in History of Christian Doctrine II, Seminar in Philosophy, Hegel, and directed study in thesis and dissertation writing. By passing his German exam, King completed his Boston language requirement. Death of King's advisor and mentor, Edgar Brightman. In February 1953, King's Boston academic advisor, Edgar S. Brightman, died, and King later chose L. Harold de Wolfe as his new advisor. In April, King and Coretta Scott announced their engagement, and they were married in June. At Otto R. Loverood's invitation at First United Baptist Church in Lowell, Massachusetts, King was asked to give a talk on what it means to be a Negro in the Deep South, and he preached the sermon, "What does it mean to believe in God?" In July 1953, Atlanta's WERD became America's first black-owned radio station. That summer, King preached God's revelation to the world, dressing Christ in false robes. In self-examination and dimensions of a complete life at Ebenezer. In January 1954, King attended the Emancipation Day celebration sponsored by the NAACP at the City Auditorium. Martin Luther King's search for a pastorship. Concurrent with the change to L. Harold de Wolfe as his new advisor in April 1953, King shifted his registration from Boston's Graduate School of Philosophy to the School of Theology. King planned to finish his PhD coursework with one more school year. That was the time of Stalin's death and Eisenhower's occupancy in the White House, when Coretta Scott and King were married on June 18, 1953. King then selected his dissertation topic. It was an academic exercise to use God's personalism as a tool of criticism rather than a subject. That was a strategy that allowed King to avoid Niebuhr's conflict with personalism. King had also put out feelers for a job in a pulpit somewhere in the South. On 3 January 1954 in Atlanta, Daddy King brought R.D. Nesbitt into the kitchen where King Jr. was finishing a meal. Neither Nesbitt nor the Kings knew each other, but Nesbitt revealed that he was the chairman of a selection committee for a new pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. The King's father told his son, "You don't want to go to Dexter." Vernon Johns hitches a ride with King to Montgomery. Martin King calculated that while waiting to hear back from the First Baptists of Chattanooga, preaching at Dexter on the morning of the 17th could do no harm. By the 16th, King felt his chances for Chattanooga had passed. Fate then intervened when King received a phone call from the current Dexter preacher, Dr. Vernon Johns, whom King knew was being forced out of Dexter. Taylor Branch picks up the story. "Young King," rasped a scratchy voice on the phone, "this is Vernon Johns. I hear you're going to preach at my former church in Montgomery tomorrow. I'm supposed to preach myself at First Baptist, but I'm sort of stranded here in Atlanta. You think I could hitch a ride over to Montgomery with you?" The reply came, "It would be an honor. Dr. Johns. Where are you? Johns replied, I'm downtown at the bus station. Well, you wait right there, Dr. Johns. I'm leaving in a few minutes and I'll pick you up on the way out of town. MLK preaches a trial sermon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Arriving in Montgomery late in the afternoon, King dropped Johns off at the parsonage of the First Baptist Church, where he was staying with the pastor, Ralph Abernathy. After smelling the air, King decided not to turn down the offer of a meal. While eating their dinner, the three preachers talked shop about King's prospects at Dexter. Fortune favored King the next day. Again, Taylor Branch picks up the story. In the Dexter pulpit the next morning, King delivered The 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life, his most polished composition. Dexter members received his manner and message so enthusiastically that Robert Nesbitt led a small group of Dexter officials to call on King that very afternoon for what was really a preliminary negotiation. King and Nesbitt both professed contentment and the need to keep their options open. Nesbitt's bold move to call King Jr. to the Dexter pulpit. Within a few weeks, events converged for King and Dexter. His competition, Walter McCall, unwisely tried to top King's sermon on the 3 dimensions of a complete life with a copycat sermon that he called the 4 dimensions of a complete life. This obviously insincere attempt doomed his performance, especially compared to a successful first performance. Afterward, Nesbitt and his friend McCall were distraught. I can't touch King, McCall said with sadness. The Dexter congregation preferred King, quote, because of his class and originality, close quote. After hearing he had been passed over by the First Baptist Church in Chattanooga, King told Nesbitt he was willing to preach a second trial. But knowing the die was cast, Nesbitt boldly moved for an early decision by breaking church precedent and calling off further trials while offering King a salary of $4,200 a year. King becomes Dexter's pastor. In the spring of 1954, Montgomery, Alabama, by unanimous vote, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church called King to its pastorate. Afterward, King met with the Dexter Pulpit Committee, and King accepted their call to the pastorate. Around this time, Boston University informed King that he had passed his qualifying exams and approved his dissertation outline. This good news was taking place at a propitious moment in King's life and for most African Americans in the South. On 17 May, in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. On 30 May, King preached Loving Your Enemies at Dexter and presided over the ordination of deacons. Later, on 5 September, King Jr. began his pastorate at Dexter with the delivery of his first sermon there. In November, Coretta and King spent 2 weeks in Boston working on a draft of his dissertation. In January 1955, Coretta then sang a solo at an Emancipation Proclamation anniversary celebration at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Summary. Dark clouds were gathering over Martin Luther King. Having decided on becoming a minister and closing in on Dexter, King was just a year away from the wrath of J. Edgar Hoover. This slide set continues and ends our topic on Martin Luther King Jr., a prophet for our time. After it is done, we'll be moving on to the next topic, J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau of Injustice. Martin Luther King Prelude from Prodigy to Prophet, Part 4. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a prophet. A member of the NAACP in Atlanta, Rosa Parks, refused to give up her seat for a white passenger. Only E.D. Nixon, the signer of her bond, and two others were aware of Rosa Parks' arrest. Nixon had served as state president of the NAACP and also as president of the Montgomery branch. Martin Luther King recalled the moment. On 1 December 1955, Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to move when she was asked to get up and move back by the bus operator. Mrs. Parks was sitting in the first seat in the unreserved section. All of the seats were taken, and if Mrs. Parks had followed the command of the bus operator, she would have stood up and given up her seat for a white male passenger who had just boarded the bus in a quiet, calm, and dignified manner so characteristic of the radiant personality of Mrs. Parks. She refused to move. The result was her arrest. One can never understand the action of Mrs. Parks until one realizes that eventually the cup of endurance runs over and the human personality cries out, "I can't take it no longer." Her trial was set for Monday, 5 December. In his own words, King Jr. recalled how the bus boycott began. Early Friday morning on 2 December 1955, Nixon called me. I listened, deeply shocked, as he described the humiliating incident. "We have taken this type of thing too long already," Nixon concluded. "I feel that the time has come to boycott the buses. Only through a boycott can we make it clear to the white folks that we will not accept this type of treatment any longer." I agreed that some protest was necessary and that the boycott method would be an effective one. Ralph Abernathy also felt that a bus boycott was our best course of action. So for 30 or 40 minutes, the three of us telephoned back and forth concerning plans and strategy. Nixon suggested that we call a meeting of all the ministers and civic leaders that same evening in order to get their thinking on the proposal, and I offered my church as the meeting place. The plan for Monday, 5 December, in his own words, King recalled, more than 40 people from every segment of Negro life were crowded into the large church meeting room. The largest number there was from the Christian ministry. I was filled with joy when I found so many of them there, for then I knew that something unusual was about to happen. Our final message read as follows: "Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or any place, Monday, 5 December. Another Negro woman has been arrested and put in jail because she refused to give up her bus seat. So, don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. If you work, take a cab, or share a ride, or walk. Come to a mass meeting Monday at 7 p.m. at the Holt Street Baptist Church for further instruction." I was on my way to church to get the leaflets out. By 11 o'clock, That morning, an army of women and young people had taken 7,000 leaflets off to distribute by hand. A miracle took place on Monday morning. King Jr. found out at midnight on Sunday that every Negro taxi company in Montgomery had agreed to support the protest on Monday morning. He and Coretta were up and fully dressed by 5:30. King recalled what happened then. I was in the kitchen drinking my coffee when I heard Coretta cry, "Martin, Martin, come quickly." I put down my cup and ran toward the living room. As I approached the front window, Coretta pointed joyfully to a slowly moving bus. "Darling, it's empty." I could hardly believe what I saw. I jumped in my car, and for almost an hour I cruised down every major street and examined every passing bus. At the peak of the morning traffic, I saw no more than 8 Negro passengers riding the buses. Instead of the 60% cooperation we had hoped for, it was becoming apparent that we had reached almost 100%. A miracle had taken place. The empty buses continued all day long. The Negro community in Montgomery was awake and united. At 3 p.m., plans were being made for a mass meeting that evening. A new organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA, was formed and officers selected. King was caught off guard. Rufus Lewis spoke from the far corner of the room. "Mr. Chairman, I would like to nominate Reverend M.L. King for president." The motion was seconded and carried, and in a matter of minutes, I was unanimously elected. The action had caught me unawares. It happened so quickly that I did not even have time to think it through. It's probable that if I had, I would have declined the nomination. They probably picked me because I had not been in town long enough to be identified with any particular group or clique. The MIA decided they would call off the protest that night if the people of Montgomery were not enthusiastic. Thousands of people came. King skipped dinner and had almost no time to draft his address for the Whole Street Baptist mass meeting. He recalls, "I turned to God in prayer. My words were brief and simple, asking God to restore my balance and to be with me in a time when I needed his guidance more than ever. By the time I had sketched an outline of the speech in my mind, my time was up. So I said goodbye to Coretta and drove to the Whole Street Church. Within 5 blocks of the church, I noticed a traffic jam. Cars were lined up, as far as I could see, on both sides of the street. It took fully 15 minutes to push my way through to the pastor's study. The enthusiasm of these thousands of people swept everything along like an onrushing tidal wave. After the opening hymn, "Onward, Christian Soldiers," King rose and stood before the pulpit. Television cameras began to shoot from all sides as the crowd grew quiet. God answered King's prayer. King stood silently for a moment. He looked over the enormous crowd of strangers who were packed in the balconies and aisles, peering in through the windows and upward from seats on the floor, and knowing his speech would be heard on loudspeakers outside. King began with a deep voice in a slow, introductory cadence. "We are here this evening for serious business," he said. His voice was in pulses. even and rising and then falling in pitch. The situation is not all new. The problem has existed over endless years. Just the other day, just last Thursday to be exact, one of the finest citizens in Montgomery, not one of the finest Negro citizens, but one of the finest citizens in all Montgomery, was taken from a bus and carried to jail and arrested because she refused to give up, to give her seat to a white person. The crowd punctuated each pause with staggered yeses and amens. He paused slightly longer. And you know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. It was an overwhelming catharsis for all present. Taylor Branch captured the moment when the crowd came to sudden life. A flock of yeses was coming back at him when suddenly the individual responses dissolved into a rising cheer, and applause exploded beneath the cheer, all within the space of a second. The startling noise rolled on and on like a wave that refused to break. And just when it seemed that the roar must finally weaken, a wall of sound came in from the enormous crowd outdoors to push the volume still higher. Thunder seemed to be added to the lower register, the sound of feet stomping on the wooden floor, until the loudness became something that was not so much heard as it was sensed by vibrations in the lungs. The giant cloud of noise shook the building and refused to go away. One sentence had set it loose somehow, pushing the call and response of the Negro church service past the din of a political rally and on to something else that King had never known before. And then a bolt of lightning hit. The voice of a prophet exuded from deep inside King. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong, King sang out. He was rocking now, his voice seeming to be at once deep and high-pitched. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong, he shouted. And the crowd seemed to explode a second time, as it had done when he said they were tired. Wave after wave of noise broke over them, cresting into the farthest reaches of the ceiling. They were far beyond Rosa Parks or the bus laws. King's last cry had fused blasphemy to the edge of his faith and the heart of theirs. The noise swelled until King cut through it to move past a point of unbearable tension. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer and never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. The crowd retreated into stunned silence as he stepped away from the pulpit. The moment when Martin Luther King Jr. became a prophet. During the Montgomery bus boycott that night, Dr. King delivered a blazing address to the mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church. As MLK biographer Taylor Branch observed, a few minutes into his address, a power of communion emerged from him that would speak inexorably to strangers who would both love and revile him, like all prophets. He was 26 and had not quite 12 years and 4 months to live. The king's message reverberated all around the United States. Just 48 hours later, on Wednesday, Hoover reacted. Somehow, King had not been in the crosshairs of his shotgun. But by Wednesday, 7 December, he was. The FBI Mobile office, as you can see here, was forwarding derogatory info about King and the bus boycott to J. Edgar Hoover. I'll have a whole lot more of the correspondence between the Bureau of Injustice and what was going on in Montgomery in a forthcoming book on Martin Luther King. These office memorandums are absolutely crucial. They provide independent attestation to what we know was happening down there and what happened that day and how it changed the world and would continue to do so. And so I'll finish once again with King's prophecy that night. The Whole Street Baptist Church. When the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of black people who injected a new meaning into the veins of history and of civilization.